So the average annual wage growth over the last 10 years is between 2.5% to 3%, right? Which is less than half of property price growth. So how on earth are you supposed to continue to keep up with that? And in fact, we're going to move to a society where people need to rent because they're unable to buy. And so this whole kind of narrative around property investors being part of the problem is just a farce. The issue is we don't have enough houses for the number of people. And also, fundamentally, we have a broken money system. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because I think that if people can understand this, they can start to understand the real problem. The real problem is not the boomers, right? The real problem is the fact that house values aren't changing as much as people think they are. Our purchasing power is changing a lot more than we think it is. Hello and welcome. You're listening to Dashdot Insider, the auditory epicenter for passionate property investors seeking a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. And I am back with Emil. It's been a little while since I've been back on the podcast. Emil, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Goose. Yourself?
Good. Actually, I am good, but I am also pissed off, which is why we're here. Now, a lot of people have probably been wondering where I've been, what I've been doing. We've been building a lot of stuff in Dashdot that has been taking my focus, which is really designed to help us democratize property investing and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I've been preoccupied with that, and it's really related to the big issues that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm excited to be jumping on. It's been a little while, but it's nice to be back.
We have copped a lot of comments. We have had a lot of people through socials, emails, and things like that. Like, is Goose coming back onto the podcast anytime soon? So from a company perspective, that's great. And from a personal perspective, we always have pretty good chats. So let's rip into it. You said that you are
pissed off. By the way,
yes.
language warning for this episode. If you've got kids with you, or if you just don't like swearing, turn something off.
You've been warned.
Yeah, you've been warned. Yeah, I am. The reason. So just to kind of to touch on the first bit first, right? So we have a mission and a purpose at Dashdot that we want to help as many people as possible to create a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. I'm summarizing our goals and objectives in a very succinct way. And so part of the reason that I have taken some of my focus away from the podcast specifically is to advance our progress on that journey. Now, part of the advancing of the progress on that journey is you've really got to start to think about what is the root cause that is making it harder and harder for people to create a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. And I think it might have even been the last episode we did together. We did like property versus crypto. I think was actually that was the last episode that we did together. And I think that's the fundamentally wrong conversation. I think the fundamentally right conversation is property versus money, or to put it another way, why is it that we seem to feel poorer as we make more money? That seems to be a problem. And a lot of people look at real estate in Australia and they say things like, oh, the boomers had it so easy. Back in 1965, you could buy a property for $70,000 and all the boomers bought up all the houses. And now look at it today, we just can't afford to buy any houses. And actually, fundamentally, the boomers did nothing wrong. Like, the boomers haven't done anything wrong. And every single person in Australia today knows that they're earning more money, but it still feels tighter. People are concerned about having kids. You've got double income households that are questioning whether they should ever have children because they don't know if they can afford it. They're asking if they're ever going to be able to own their own home. They're asking if that is even still a reality. And to be frank, for a lot of people, probably not. Like, probably renting for the rest of your life is going to be your reality. Like, that's just real.
I was talking to a friend of mine recently. She is looking to get into a property. Not sure what the smart move is going to be. Looking for properties up around about the 800K mark and above. Looking at how much that particular area is projected to increase and how much they can save per year. They can save around about 60 grand per year, which is decent, right? There's two of them.
That's pretty good. Saving 60 grand a year, that's pretty good, right?
Saving 60 grand, right? Like, after you pay to live somewhere, you pay all of your bills, you've paid all of your tax, you're left with 60 grand. They're doing pretty well. I don't know, but I would guess maybe combined income somewhere around about 200K, maybe 200K plus, right? They might be a little bit north of that. They're looking to get a property. They've got some decent savings, but then it's a case of, well, can we actually get into the property? Should we buy it now? Now, if they don't, that 60K that they are saving, the properties that they would be looking at are probably going to go up by more than 100K. Right? If you're looking at something around the 800K mark, 900K in a year. And so you're falling, that's a couple, 200K I would estimate, and they are lagging behind the property market. It's not like it was 30, 40, 50 years ago where the way money worked was a little bit different. And boomers and even Gen Xers, you could save, we don't have enough for a property. We'll just save for another year, and then we will be able to afford it because we're catching up on the property market. Now you're falling further and further and further behind. Now, if you're not earning the 200K, shit, what do you do?
Well, this is right. So this is actually part of the bigger issue, right? And this is what I think people need to start to try and understand, because it feels less and less fair the more and more we walk into our future. And I know that, and I don't feel good about that. A lot of people sitting around in Australia would say, well, it's property investors are the problem, which is just fundamentally untrue, right? So property investors make up typically only about 30% of all property ownership. And of course, renters need somewhere to live. And in fact, because property prices keep increasing more and more and wages don't, so the average annual wage growth over the last 10 years is between 2.5% to 3%, right? Which is less than half of property price growth. So how on earth are you supposed to continue to keep up with that? And in fact, we're going to move to a society where people need to rent because they're unable to buy. And so this whole kind of narrative around, property investors being part of the problem is just a farce. The issue is we don't have enough houses for the number of people. And also, fundamentally, we have a broken money system. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because I think that if people can understand this, they can start to understand the real problem. The real problem is not boomers, right? The real problem is the fact that house values aren't changing as much as people think they are. Our purchasing power is changing a lot more than we think it is, right?
So what do you mean by that for everyone listening at home?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is I like to think about a jar of Vegemite, right? So I don't know these exact numbers, but I'll use it to paint the point because it's something people can mostly understand. You could probably buy a jar of Vegemite for like 30 cents back in 1970. And today it's probably $5. Yet Kraft have invested billions of dollars over that period of time to improve their production capability, improve their efficiency, improve their technology. So theoretically, the price of a jar of Vegemite should have gone down, not up. I think everyone can understand that, right? The price to produce oil, it should be cheaper, right? So like because of technological advances, improvements in productivity, theoretically, prices should be lower than they are. So why aren't they? And fundamentally, it's because we have an increase in money supply. So if we go back to 1965, we've had, now there's several ways you can measure an increase in money. And I want to try and make sure this isn't too complicated, but I want to try and paint the point, right? So there's M0, M1, M2, and M3 money supply. And I'm not going to get bogged down in what they all are, but M0 is basically like at the central bank level, how much money have they got? M3 is kind of like all of the money, including, it's kind of like the outer edges of the money ecosystem is kind of the way of thinking about it. Now, M3 money supply in Australia has increased since 1965 to March 2024. It's increased by a compound annual growth rate of 11% per year. M1 money supply, which is probably a better metric for us to use, and I won't get into the mechanics of why because it would probably be a little too complicated. Since 1975, so 49 years, not 59 years, just for those who are counting, it has increased by 12.3% compound annual growth rate per year. So we've been printing basically, or adding liquidity to the system at a rate of 12.3% a year for the last 49 years. M1 over the last 10 years is 10.9%. Now, what does that mean? Why should you care? Well, the reason for that is because that actually tells you that the amount of dollars in circulation, or the amount of money that exists in our system, has increased by 10% a year, which is the same as saying if you had 100 diamonds and they were all worth $100, and then someone gave you 10 more diamonds, like what's going to happen to the value of those diamonds? The value is going to go down. The purchasing power goes down in relation to the amount of money in circulation, right? Versus hard assets. So in effect, the amount of money that gets printed is the rate at which your currency is devaluing, because we all know that scarcity is a requirement for the hardness of money, right? So if you have a finite supply of cash, then it will hold its value. if you print more money, it is worth less. So if you have $10 billion of money circulating in Australia in 1965, and then $3 trillion worth of money circulating in Australia in 2024, the value of each one of those units of money is going to be less because there's so much more circulating. Does that make sense? Have I explained that?
Let me crystallize that a little bit, or try to make sure that I've got this right. Let's say that you have 1,000, let's use jars of Vegemite because they're a little bit fun. Let's say that there are only 1,000 jars of Vegemite in all of Australia. And we have a money supply of $1,000. So each jar of Vegemite will be worth $1 if that's the only thing that anyone's ever going to buy, right? Just to keep it super simple.
Yeah,
and then
that's a good way to say it. That's a good way of breaking it down, yeah.
And then let's say that the government prints, and we can get into the mechanics of how they print the money, but let's say $100 is added to the money supply. So now we have $1,100 and we have 1,000 jars of Vegemite. Well, then each jar of Vegemite could therefore be worth a higher number of dollars. Now, that doesn't mean that the Vegemite has become more valuable. It's still just Vegemite. It's still just 1,000 jars of Vegemite. What it means is that the value of each dollar has become 10% less. And so that's what we find in society. We have $10 trillion as the M3 money, what we call the M3 money supply. And I like using M3 as a good measure because it includes the large institutional money market funds that are buying large property and things like that. I think it's a good gauge of how much money is out there.
I agree. My preference is M2, but I just couldn't find reliable M2 data for Australia. So
that's the tricky thing, right? M2 is normally the best because it includes all of the savings that people have, all of the savings deposits that we have, and all of the money market deposit accounts. So using that is great. M3 is a reasonable proxy for M2. And I was looking at the M3 data. At the moment, right now, we are printing about $20 billion. When I say printing, there are two ways that money gets created in the system. One is quantitative easing, which is when the government basically get the money machine and money machine goes burr, or actually it's someone just updating a spreadsheet saying, we now have this much more money.
Someone types a new number into the system. Yeah.
That's what happens, right? And it's the same. And the other way is when banks issue loans and they create money at the point that the loan is created. It's not like you put $100 in and then the bank loans that $100 out. You put $100 in, the bank says, thanks, we'll give you a return. When they loan out $100, they actually create that $100. So we're getting about $20 billion added to the money supply every year, which adds to somewhere between 8 and 9% per year on the M3 supply. M3 supply is about $3 trillion at the moment. And so adding 20 billion per month, which looks like what we're doing at the moment, is going to be around about 8%. Now, that's not what inflation figures say. Inflation and CPI and everything like that is calculated differently. So we can talk about real inflation, and I think we get into a definition issue here because what inflation really is like when you inflate a tire, you put more air into it. When you inflate the economy, you're putting more dollars into it. You're not actually creating more value. But if you look at a definition online of what inflation is, it's going to say the increase in prices. But it's not the increase in value of those things.
No, it's the decrease in purchasing. It's the decrease in purchasing power because of the increase in the money supply, which is the fundamental
the money's
issue.
Worth less. The money ends up being worth less. So if you're holding $100,000 in savings at the moment, in terms of purchasing power, in terms of how valuable that is, in a year, that's probably going to be worth about $92,000 or $90,000, something in that quantum.
So if we use the last 10 years of M1 money supply as 10.9%, basically what that would mean is you'd be losing 10.9% per year in purchasing power, compounding, which basically means if the money supply is increasing by 10.9% a year, your purchasing power will be cut in half in 6.61 years. Now, if we use the long-term M1 money supply, which is 12.3%, that means that you're going to lose half your purchasing power in 5.85 years. So that means if you have $100,000 today, you will only be able to buy $50,000 worth of goods in roughly 6 years. So this whole kind of story of property doubles in value every 7 years starts to even though it's not functionally true, the heuristic starts to make a lot more sense when you realize, oh, actually, I'm losing roughly 7% of my purchasing power per year. Hang on a second, and property prices are going up roughly 7% a year, which is the double in, or 10% a year, sorry. They're double in 7 years. I'm losing half my purchasing power in about 7 years, and property prices double every 7 years. That seems a little odd, doesn't it? Considering the utility value hasn't specifically changed.
Right. And so thinking that property doubles every 7 years, it's probably not the property doubling in value. It's the value of your cash becoming worth half every 7 years. Now, how does this contrast with what we've had historically? Well, at the moment, I would say we've got very, very soft money, because you mentioned hard money and soft money before. And what defines hard money and soft money is what you call a stock to flow ratio. The stock is how much of it there is at the moment. So in Australia, we've got 3 trillion M3. And the flow is how much more gets created. And we're getting about 20 billion a month. 20 billion a month. To give you an idea of how much that is, 240 to 250 billion a year. That is more than what the US has given to the Ukraine to fight the war that they're having with Russia.
240 billion a year divided by a population of roughly 24 million, right?
Yeah, 24, billion? 25, 26, something around there.
I'd have to do the maths on that, but that's a lot of dollars per person, basically.
It is. It's a hell of a lot.
That's a hell of a lot. But yeah, keep going about the soft money.
And so at the moment, we've got very, very soft money. Hard money is something like gold, which only increases by between 1% and 2%. And that's why gold was used historically. Now, if you go back to the Roman Empire, and I've talked about this on other podcasts, so I'll only do it very, very brief service at the moment. When Julius Caesar minted the aureus, it was worth 1/40th of a Roman pound. It wasn't until 301 AD under Diocletian that it was down to 1/72nd, so about 4.5 grams of gold. So it's gone down by less than half in 300 years. So we're talking about very, very slow inflation, extremely slow over the course of 350 years. And that is one of the reasons that their society was really good. And they had the Pax Romana. It was a time of thriving. They built all of this stuff. At the moment, we are in the opposite. We are everything that we're doing. Like, there's no point saving right now. The current financial system basically has trained us that there is no point saving money. And there are all kinds of social and scientific ramifications and artistic ramifications that can flow on to that. But basically, if you get your cash from whatever it is that you do, right, you get your salary, you've got two basic options. One, spend it, or two, invest it. There's no saving option.
So this is where the money is broken part comes into it, because as we've discussed before, money by definition should have three characteristics. It should be a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a unit of account. So what we have with the dollar, the Australian dollar, the US dollar, modern currencies pretty much everywhere in the world, is we have a unit of account. Right? Because we can measure things in dollars. That Mars bar costs X amount of dollars. We have a unit of account. We can all agree that we're going to measure things in dollars. We have a medium of exchange. I will trade you my dollars for your goods and services. We can use that as a trading mechanism.
Easy to exchange.
But the store of value piece is completely broken. Right? So it is not a functional store of value. Now, you were talking about the stock to flow ratio of gold. You were talking about stock to flow ratio earlier, and I think you mentioned gold as well. But the average increase in gold is like 1.5 to 2% a year. That's the flow rate, basically, which means the half-life of value in gold is about 35 years, which basically means because of the amount of new gold coming into the market, your purchasing power in gold relative, if you use that as a mechanism of measurement, is about 35 years, roughly, right? 1.5 to 2%. That's the kind of the half-life of money. The half-life of an Australian dollar is about 6 years, right? And so fundamentally it is broken. It is very hard to justify money being a store of value if it devalues that quickly. Now, there's always going to be some degree of timeline. I mean, like I guess my pen that I'm holding right now has some degree of value, so I can buy it for $1, and then maybe later on I can sell it for 50 cents or something like that. It has some value storage mechanism, right? But it doesn't have the other characteristics of money. But the half-life of the value is actually really, really, really important. Which is why once upon a time, if someone was a millionaire, it was like, whoa, you've made it. You've oh my god, imagine being a millionaire. Being a millionaire, that's just the price of entry today.
A promising start.
Yeah, in the very not too distant future, it'll be at a point where it's like, unless you have a net worth of north of 7 figures or even 8 figures by the time you're at the end of your 20s, right? You won't have a shot. It's getting out of control, and it's only getting worse. And you mentioned the softness of money. So, by the way, just as a quick, just did the quick maths on it, $240 billion or $20 billion of a month increase in money supply divided by 26.6 million people is roughly $9,022 of per person in Australia. That the value of money is going down each year. Now, I just want to dimensionalize that for everyone, because anyone listening to this podcast that earns money is paying income tax. Probably 30. We'll just call it 30% for simplicity's sake, right? That about a third of the money is going in income tax. Plus, then you have all of the other tariffs and charges that you pay and all of that kind of stuff, right? And so most of your money is getting taxed away. But you can kind of conceptualize it on the income tax, right? All right, I'm paying. This is the hidden tax. This is the extra tax that they don't tell you about, right? That is basically devaluing your savings. So you've already paid tax on it. And then it goes into the bank account. You're like, yay, I paid tax on it. Now the money's mine. And then the government is saying, well, actually what we're going to do is we're just going to print some more money over here, or we're going to add liquidity to the system, because it's not always as simple as printing money. Printing money kind of gives people this idea that there's a money printing machine, but you pointed out there's other ways that liquidity gets created or money gets created, and I want to come back to that in a second. Yeah, it's very sneaky. So they're basically saying, yeah, we'll tax you we'll tax a third of your money on the way in when you get paid, and then we're just going to hidden tax you by another 10 to 12% a year by creating more money in the system, and that is how they're funding all of the stuff. It's a hidden tax.
Yeah, the numbers are spot on there. When you look at the amount of revenue that the government gets from tax, particularly income tax, it's about $650 billion per year. And when you look at how much money just gets created, it's another 240. So yeah, you mentioned 33%. You are looking at about an additional 12% of a hidden tax. It's taxation without the legislation.
Yeah, bingo.
No one's voted for it.
Now, you know what's really bonkers about this, right? Everyone thinks that we operate. So most people understand. Actually, probably most people don't understand. This is actually kind of fundamental. But most people don't understand money. But we operate in a debt-based monetary system, right? Fundamentally. So once upon a time, it was a gold-backed monetary system. We had the gold standard. Then we went off the gold standard and we said, okay, it's all just going to be credits, right? It's all going to be credits that we're going to trade around. And we moved to a debt-based monetary system. Now, most people who would understand this concept would believe that we have a fractional reserve banking system. Now, what that means for someone who's just hearing this term for the first time is the idea that for a bank to lend money, it must have a certain amount of cash in reserves in the bank. Now, generally, that's like if you go and deposit $1,000, they'll keep 10. They'll keep. So if you deposit $1,000, they'll keep 100, and then they could lend out another 900. That's kind of been the general idea. So right, so they're holding onto all this money. However, in the US, and I want to talk about the US a bit as well, and I'll talk about why it's important that we do talk about the US. In 2020, the US eliminated reserve requirements for all depository institutions in the United States, which means that they no longer require any banks to hold reserves, which means that every time they create debt or credit, they're literally just manufacturing liquidity or cash out of thin air without any requirement to have that collateralized by anything, which is crazy. Now, that's the US. In Australia also does not have a reserve requirement for banks. So we think that we've got okay, so the banks are lending out all this money and there's a big pile of collateral sitting there, and that's not true. The banks must adhere to liquidity and capital adequacy requirements set by regulatory authorities to ensure stability and solvency, which is another way of saying lend as much money as you want, as long as you're collecting cash, or as long as you have enough revenues coming in and you're making enough profit, you can lend out as much money as you want, and you don't need to have a specific amount in reserve, just as long as you can service the debts that you're sort of creating, which basically means there's an infinite money creation machine happening in commercial banks as well, which is freaking mad.
And there is no real regulatory body that is keeping an eye on it properly and regulating it properly. Now, we are told that we need this system and we need to be adding more cash to the system to keep up with production. So if we go back to the Vegemite jar example earlier, it's okay to print or to create an extra $100. Remember, we've got 1,000 Vegemite jars, we've got $1,000. Somebody creates another $100, right? A bank or the government. But if in the meantime Kraft have become more efficient and they have created another 100 jars for the amount of resources that it used to take for them to create 1,000, if they've created 1,100, then it's still going to cost $1 for each one. And we're told that we need to keep on printing the money to keep up with production. That's bullshit. It's a total lie. It's completely not necessary. And now it's not like, well, there's an increase in production of, say, 2%, 3%, so we're adding that much more. It's like, oh, yes, we've got an increase in production, but the prices just keep on going up and up and up.
Yeah, so that's it. The thing you just said is actually completely opposite of how it should be, right? It's actually the complete opposite, because technology increases productivity. So technology can be broadly defined as machines and all kinds of stuff, right? Everything from spreadsheets to calculators to computers to AI, all of these things are all technology. Everything's technology, right? But advancements in technology increase productivity broadly, which should deflate the costs of goods and services. So we should be living in a deflationary world where prices go down over time. So if that is true, you don't need more dollars. You actually you don't need to add money into the system, right? Because all the money exists and everything gets cheaper over time. You would need to come up with smaller and smaller denominations, not larger and larger denominations, like what happens when you have inflation and you end up looking at Zimbabwe and they've got $1 trillion notes or whatever it is, which is what. So what you just said, this the justification for printing more money is actually the opposite of what the factual reality should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is exactly the way it should be. The justification is all bullshit. You can say, oh, we need this for productivity, but it doesn't make any sense. And governments can say that they need money for social programs or however they want to waste it. You don't have to go back that far. Well, okay, maybe it is quite far, but it wasn't until 1915 that there was actually federal income tax in Australia. And the government can run things without having an income tax, right? It was all just excises and customs duties and things like that. And they were able to make enough money to run a country efficiently. We're not in that world now. We're in a country where we have this incredibly bloated government that needs more and more cash, which is why I've said on a number of podcasts, my number one measure for determining how the real estate market is going to perform is how much does the government need cash? If the government needs cash, they're going to tell the banks, go mental with the loans, add as much money to the system as we need. When it starts to get out of control, we're going to lift the interest rates and we're going to call it inflation and things like that. Now, I did mention earlier, there is an actual rate of inflation in terms of how much money is getting pumped into the Australian economy in the same way that you would pump up a bike tire. That's different from what we're told. We're told about things like CPI or an official inflation rate.
Which can I just jump in there? Like CPI is the biggest load of horse shit in the world because they keep changing what is in the basket of goods.
Yes. It's a political measure. It's not an economic measure.
So the actual rate of inflation is the actual increase in the money supply. That's the actual rate of inflation. It's not okay if we cherry pick some goods and services out and we just look at those. Oh, it's 3% or 4%. It's not. In fact, just let me go on this for a little bit, because if you're listening to this, you're 28 minutes into the podcast roughly, right? And you're hearing us talk about money, and you're like, why do I care about this, right? Let me talk to you about this, right? If we can agree that on average the money supply is increasing by about 11.4% a year, right? We can also measure the number of building approval rates over the last 10 years has actually gone down by 2.2% compound annual growth rate. So let me just give you some numbers on that if you're listening to this. So building approval rates have gone from 16.8 thousand building approvals in April 2014 to 13.1 thousand in April 2024. So that's a compound annual growth rate of negative 2.2% per year for the last 10 years. So we've been building less and less new buildings for the last 10 years, 2.2% a year. The population in Australia has been growing over the last 10 years from 23.64 million in 2014 to 26.73 million in 2024. So that has increased by 1.24% a year. So the number of people has gone up by 1.24. The number of new houses being added, so number of populations gone up by 1.24% a year. Number of houses being added to the system, which is the stock to flow ratio you were talking about, is negative 2.2%, right? So if you've got a negative stock to flow ratio, that is a recipe for prices going up. And then in addition to that, we have an increase in money supply of an average of 11.4% a year, which basically means, right, if you can see that there's a 3.44% difference between the amount of people and the amount of houses getting built, plus the 11.4% a year, that means that you've got a 13.84% hurdle rate, or that's the price pressure on real estate each year, right? So you've got a 13.84% per annum hurdle rate just to stay in the game, which is wild.
That is crazy, and it gets even worse if you start looking just at the last year or two, because looking at the rate of population increase, we did some stats on this recently, and the number of new migrants for a 1 year period, I can't remember exactly what that 1 year period was. I believe it was 2022 to 2023, but I'd have to check that. So a 12-month period, a lot of people were saying, oh, yeah, we've got 200,000 new migrants, 400,000 new migrants. Net migration was 737,000. And you add that onto the natural growth that we have in Australia, which is between 100 and 110,000 per year. That means we've got about 850,000 more people coming in. Oh, sorry, we've got 850,000 more people in Australia than we had the previous year. Then you have a look at the number of building approvals, and we're under 200,000. So where are all these people going to live? So it's becoming more and more and more acute. We're starting to create money at a faster rate. We're starting to approve buildings at a slower rate, right? It's going down by the 2.2% per year. So that's the stock to flow rate decreasing. And we've got migration hitting record levels. So this is bad, right?
By the way, just did some quick maths on that, and just very, very broadly, 850,000 net increase in population over about a 26 million-ish base in population. That's an increase of 3.2%. So that's an increase in population of 3.2%, which is very broadly, and that's a rough number, but that's roughly double what the 10-year compound annual growth rate of population increase is. And so that then broadens the gap between building supply and population supply from 3.44% up to like 5.44%, which actually means your hurdle rate is closer to 17%. That's the hurdle rate that you need to try and beat if you want to be able to maintain progress in line with property price pressures, which is the problem.
And property price pressures are obviously very, very related to, but actually different from what actually happens in the property market, because you have an extension on top of that. Different areas are going to go up by more and less. And also the overall money supply, a large chunk of that goes into the property market. A disproportionate amount of that goes into the property market because it's a store of wealth. Whereas the cost of onions, things that are very cheap and easy to make, doesn't necessarily go up. So even though the money supply might be going up by 11% or 8%, depending on which year we're looking at, 10-year average, 1 year average, whatever it is, it's still huge, but a disproportionate amount of that goes into specifically good assets. And I think this is really where we're going with this podcast. You need to be getting into good assets, hard assets, where you can store your wealth. Because if you keep it in cash, you're not going to make it. You're not going to be able to save. It's not 40 years ago where, okay, we don't have enough cash yet. Let's save for another year and then we'll be in a better position. If you save for another year, you're in a worse position. And the door's closing. And I fear that we are reaching a point, I don't know when it's going to happen, where if you don't have property, if you're not in property, you're never going to be able to get in. I don't know exactly when it's happening, but it's coming up fast. It's coming up really fast.
Yeah, so it's actually the speed is increasing, because when you that's how exponents work, right? If you have a compound annual growth rate of 5% a year or whatever, well, guess what? The step change at step 30 is going to be a hell of a lot more than the step change at step 1, right? And so even though the average growth rate is staying the same, the differential between wage price growth and the we'll call it a 15% hurdle rate, just to kind of round it out, and the hurdle rate being defined as the increase in money supply plus the difference between the building approval rate and the current population increase. We'll call it about 15%, or even if you wanted to use 13%, that's fine. The increase in wages over the last 10 years has been about 2.7%, I believe. I have to double check those, right? So I think it got as high as 4% in the last year, but I don't think that's going to go between 2.5% and 3% over the last 10 years. That's the average, right? So let's be generous and say 3%. So then you got the difference between 3% and 15%, right? So 15% is the hurdle rate. Your wages are going up on average by 3% a year. But the price pressure on real estate is about 15% a year is the actual price pressure once you consider inflation. So that's a 12% gap. So the compound annual rate that it gets harder is about 12% a year.
So that's how much more expensive property is getting compared to your situation.
Yeah. Yep, and to put that in context, that basically means that it will be twice as hard in about 7 years, 6 years. Yeah, it'd be twice as hard in about 6 years if you use the rule of 72. It'd be roughly about that number. So if you think it's hard now, however hard you think it is now, it'll be about twice as hard in 6 years' time.
All right. One of the numbers that you mentioned in there, and this is just to show you how conservative we are being with these numbers, was the rate of new building approvals and how that's going down. The number of new building approvals each year is going down by a little bit. And so we've pulled out a number, net negative 2.2%, right, on what it was the previous year. Now, that wouldn't be a problem.
That's a 10-year moving average, by the way. That's 10 years. That's 10 years. Every year for 10 years, it's gone down by 2.2%.
That wouldn't be a problem if we had an oversupply, or if supply was meeting demand, if we had a reduction in the number of people coming into the country or something like that. But what we're seeing is building approvals go down and down and down and down and down every single year. And we're seeing the number of people entering the country going up and up and up and up every single year. And so even though we've used the number negative 2.2%, I think it's actually a lot worse than that, because you need to factor in how many we actually need. And when you factor in the deficit of how many houses there are, it's actually much, much worse, but not easy to calculate. So what should people be doing? I definitely think they need to be getting into hard assets. What other things do we need to sort of...
Well, I want to touch on one point, right? Because we talked about stock to flow, which is a really, really important factor. But then there's also supply and demand, right? So stock to flow is the measurement of how many things exist versus how many new things get created, right? So to your point, using the example of Vegemite jars, if 100 Vegemite jars existed and then 10 new Vegemite jars were getting created each year, the stock to flow would be 10%, 10% stock to flow ratio, right? Because gold supply increases by 1.5% to 2% a year, the stock to flow ratio, so the amount of gold and the amount of gold that exists on the planet never goes down because it's basically indestructible. So the amount of gold supply, the stock versus the flow, the inflow, it's a stock to flow ratio of about 1.5% to 2%, right? So when you have and going back to the hardness of assets. Right, the hardness of assets is dictated by that stock to flow ratio. So if you are easily able to increase the supply of any asset, whether that be dollars or houses or anything, gold, for example, if all of a sudden you could in 1 week pull out of the ground the total amount of gold that is equal to all of the amount of gold that currently exists on Earth, what would happen to gold prices? Gold prices would go down, right? So you would have too much flow to the stock. That is one side of it, but you also have a demand side, right? So there's supply and demand, which is different, because you could have a stock to flow ratio of like, yeah, okay, I mean, I've got green rocks and no more green rocks are getting made. So my stock to flow ratio is awesome because I've got all the green rocks and no more green rocks are getting made. And that's great. But if no one wants green rocks, then who cares, right? Who cares, right? Who cares, right? So you have to have a demand side to it. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. So we actually, in the real estate market, have a negative stock to flow ratio. Now, if you have a positive stock to flow ratio, it means that the value goes down over time. So because of the relative value goes down over time, not the nominal value measured in dollars, but the relative value to itself, which is why I was talking about the half-life of gold being about 35 years based on a stock to flow ratio of about 1.5 to 2%. If you have a negative stock to flow ratio, then you actually have an increase in price pressure. But you can then there's a different dynamic, which is demand, because to your point, if we stopped building houses but also stopped having any more people in Australia, then we would create some degree of kind of stagnation around the demand side of the assets that exist in the market, right? But because we are also increasing the number of people at a faster rate, so we've got an inverse, we've got a kind of a vacuum that we're causing there. But then there's other factors which are increasing the demand side outside of just people versus properties in that relationship, right? And so the other factors that are increasing demand side is the devaluation of money. People realize if they don't get into property, they're getting poorer. So there's this kind of like feverish, whirlwind effect of people increasing. So the demand is actually increasing outside of just the number of people the number of people versus the number of properties.
Right. And so it's that perfect capitalist cycle. The rich keep on getting richer and richer and richer. And if you are like now more than ever in all of Australia's history, you're not going to be able to save your way to wealth. Right. I gave you that example earlier. We've got someone combined income probably around the $200,000 a year mark, which is decent. Double income, no kids. And they're wondering what to do and fairly well terrified of what the future is going to hold. And if they make their next decision, if they don't get it right, they could be in trouble. Could be like, oh yeah, well you've bought one property, you're locked up because theory of constraints and things like that. You're locked up because it might be a principal place of residence. You might not be able to get into the market again for 2 or 3 years. And if you try to get into the market in 2 or 3 years, property prices may well be 30%, 40%, 50% more than they are at the moment. And so how are you going to get an investment property at that point? So all these kinds of decisions around, should people be rent vesting? Should they be buying their principal place of residence so they've got that locked in? Should they be buying a couple of investment properties and then using that to kind of snowball a portfolio and then get the principal place of residence at the end? All of these conversations are really, really important. But at the top of it, headlining it all is you need to be getting into property. Otherwise, you probably never will be.
Exactly. But this is exactly right. And so I'm one of my flaws is that I am a perpetual optimist. It serves me well to be a perpetual optimist, but I can be optimistic to a fault. And for the very first time over the last few months, 6, 8 years, 12 months, whatever, I've started to become very, very concerned. Very, very concerned. Very concerned for the well-being of the people in our society because, to your point, unless you can own hard assets, you are going to get poorer over time, right? And the rich get richer, in inverted commas, and the poor get poorer, right? But it's really people who own assets manage to avoid having their money destroyed, right? And that is a really, really important thing to understand. So the way to avoid ending up poorer in your future is to make sure you buy hard assets. Now, there are several hard assets. Gold is a reasonably hard asset. Bitcoin is an extremely hard asset. Real estate is a fantastic hard asset. Now, the reason that real estate is such a fantastic asset is because of its relative volatility and your ability to get leverage on it, right? And it's got utility value and it can produce yield. And there's all of these characteristics that make real estate an exceptionally good hard asset versus other hard assets. Now, that's not to say that Bitcoin is not good, and that's not to say that gold doesn't have a place in a portfolio. But real estate really fundamentally has some characteristics and qualities that for the everyday person is going to be far more desirable than some of those other hard assets, namely the ability to get debt. Now, debt is awesome if the government is creating more money, because you're borrowing money today, right? We've already talked about the half-life of money. You can borrow $1 million today, and in 6 years, the value of that $1 million that you've bought is going to be $500,000 because of the half-life of money, right? 6-7 years. And so if you can get today's dollars and pay them back in tomorrow's dollars, which are going to be worth less, that is a good thing. That is a good thing to do. So if your cost of capital or the cost of debt is less than the real rate of inflation, you are winning, right? I have absolutely no aspiration to pay down the debts on any of my properties, or, debt's awesome.
Let the government inflate that debt away.
Yeah.
Inflation's great if you have debt. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it's awesome
if you have debt. If you have savings, it's the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. And so kind of you kind of touched on an interesting point earlier, and we've sort of been talking about this throughout as a thematic throughout, the whole idea of home ownership, that might just not even be the best way of doing things. Whether it's even possible for you, by the way, because the median house price is about $933,000 in Australia these days, whether that's actually a desirable pursuit is another thing altogether, depending on what you're trying to create. Because to your point, when you buy a residential, a principal place of residence, you tend to destroy your borrowing power, which is going to very significantly limit your ability to go and buy more assets using debt, which devalues over time. Your debt the value of your debt decays, which is awesome. And so if you meaningfully want to get ahead, then you should understand that and get comfortable with it, because the more debt you can get, the better you're going to be setting yourself up for success, because you can arbitrage the difference between the cost of your debt and the growth rate of the hard assets you've got. And the thing is, this isn't just this is not, hey guys, you should invest in property because then you'll get rich and you can go buy nice cars and, sail boats around the world. This is, hello, wake up. Unless you get your cash out of the broken money system and into hard assets, you will die poor, which is a very strong statement to make, but it is true. And this is why I'm very concerned for people, because it's like we're in a race in a direction, and we have to push hard to try and keep people in there. At Dashdot, we're trying to build tools and stuff that are going to throw that lifeline out further to help more people further and further out, because it's getting harder and harder and harder and harder and harder every year, roughly by a rate of 12% a year. 12% compounding annual difficulty increase. Nobody really likes that. And so the reality of the situation is today, despite how crazy it is in the market at the moment, and by the way, just to give you an idea how crazy it is in the market at the moment, real estate agents don't even understand how to price properties in most places anymore. There was a property that we were looking at for a client. It was listed, I might get the numbers wrong, but it'll be directionally correct. It was listed for about $450. We put in an offer of $550, and we were 29th or 23rd out of 119 offers on this property. Insane. Right. And this is happening everywhere. This is happening everywhere. And why is this happening everywhere? It's because of all of the things we've been talking about. And the thing is, unless you actually could get in to participate, and today is going to be the best opportunity you have to do that, you're going to be struggling further and further and further as we get into the future.
All right, based on everything you've said, it could sound like the system is unfair. And I think my personal view is the system is completely unfair. It doesn't reward people necessarily who work hard. It rewards people who, they have the guts to invest in property, right? They have the means, they have access to credit. And all people really need to do is make a decision that they are going to invest in probably the safest asset that you can find that has the best risk-adjusted return, or they're going to get poor. Now, it might feel like this is a broken system. You and I agree it is. If you're listening, you may well think that it's a broken system. We didn't create the system, by the way. It's the politicians, it's the government that have created these policies that have incentivized property as an investment class instead of something that everyone can own and have the great Australian dream of being able to live and afford and live in your own home, right? That Australian dream is very, very quickly disappearing for a lot of people. It's not our fault. It's nothing to do with property investors. It's entirely the government's fault. Now, they can't do anything about it. The government, it's full of idiots to start with, but even if they had smart people, the train's left the station now. I can't see any financial mechanisms by which they can wind things back without sacking half the government. The only way they can do it is by reducing government expenditure, and they're not going to do that. They just simply don't have the minerals to do it. I mean minerals in terms of like intestinal fortitude. They don't have the guts to lay off half the government. And
so a couple of things. I don't think that would solve it anyway. That's a nominal byline in the economic system. But do I agree that we should have a minimalist government? I'm like some kind of combination anarcho-minicist capitalist. I'm like a neo-capital anarchist minicist type.
You're hardcore libertarian, I would say. Small government, protect individual freedoms as much as possible. You don't need a lot to do that.
I think I defined myself. I think I was trying to work it out with ChatGPT, and I worked out I was a minarcho-capitalist, like a minute.
If the government did reduce half of their expenditure, which they're not going to do, but if they did, then they could regulate the banks and they could say, let's reduce the money supply. They can still generate enough from taxes to be able to cover their bills. They're not going to be in need of cash, and everything could slow down and gradually it could normalize. I think we've reached escape velocity. I don't think the ball's coming back down to earth. I think it's gone. And unless you get into hard assets, like to give you an idea of how quickly the real estate market can be moving, we had a client and they went in at 650 or 660. I don't remember the exact number. It's 650 or 660. It must have been 660. We passed on it. Called from the agent a month later, said it's 690 if you want it. That's 30 grand in 30 days. That's how quickly things are moving in some parts of Australia. So you try catching up on that.
Gabby and I bought a property 2 years ago, roughly to the date, well, pretty much 2 years ago. We'll call it 24 months. And it's gone up by 50% in 24 months. So like that's the rate that it's moving. Hey, great for us. You know, we bought it in the 400s, it's now in the high 600s. Awesome, right? 50%.
It's not great for Australia.
No, it's not. And so I just want to pick up on something you said earlier. You said it doesn't feel fair. And I think fairness is something that people should try and take out of the conversation because fairness has this kind of ideas around it, around like justice, and some people, it's unfair for some and it's fair. It's like, actually, that's not the conversation. Right? The conversation is not about, is it fairer for some people than others? You need to look at it as a systemic thing, right? Go, okay, cool. I exist in an environment where there are these component elements in the environment that is leading to these specific outcomes. Okay, what am I going to do with that data and that information? It's not about, oh, well, Johnny's got 5 properties, so now he can get ahead. That's not fair. I don't feel like I'm ever going to get on the ladder. It's not Johnny's problem, right? It's fundamentally not a fairness thing, right? This is the game that is being played. We are in an exponentially changing system. So if you can understand how the system works, then you can decide how to hitch your wagon and get on board so that you don't get left behind. And I can tell you that people who are going to be worse off in 10 years' time are the people who are shouting and waving their fist at the sky saying, this isn't fair, woe is me, someone come and help me with my problems. They are the ones who are doing nothing to pragmatically move them along the path. Understand the rules of the game, get involved. You are the only person who can save yourself. No one is going to come and save you. And just sitting around shaking your fist and shouting at the sky like a crazy old man, this needs to be different, is not going to progress you. To your point, Emil, the system has, I believe, also has reached escape velocity. There is no functional way out anytime soon that is going to specifically change this. And so if you can recognize that, then what are you going to do about it, right? Now, but by the way, I had a thought the other day that if I spontaneously woke up one day and was the Prime Minister, what's the first thing I would do is I would ban any increase in money supply in Australia. I would turn the Australian dollar into hard money. And that would break heaps of stuff, by the way. but it would fix heaps of things as well. But it's that level of extremity that has to happen in order for us to move us to a new system, because the current system, the current dynamic doesn't work.
This is what hardcore Bitcoiners believe. Fix the money, you fix the world, and all of the social problems can get fixed by doing exactly what you suggested there. Let's make the Australian dollar the hardest currency in the world. Ban all expansion would be great. Back to your point about, it is a game. It's not a fair game. It's not fair that person gets to be rich and somebody else doesn't, because it doesn't relate to the value that they provide society. Someone might work their whole life as a farmer, toiling the fields. They might be in manufacturing. They might be working at a meatworks like my uncle for his whole life, 40, 45 years, carving beef every day. Or, eventually you get to be a manager and you get to earn a little bit more. You're adding genuine value to society. Our society is not set up to reward that person. Our society is set up to reward the person who manages to get credit and who invests in property. Those are the rules of the game. Now that you know that those are the rules of this absurd game that we're all forced to play, basically, and deciding not to play is still making a decision, right? If you don't get in and win, right, now that you've heard this podcast, if you don't get in, if you don't make a decision, that you're going to do everything you can to try to win this game. If you lose, that's on you. That's not on the system anymore, because now you know what you need to do.
Yeah, I agree with you, right, man? It's actually funny because my brother is a farmer, and I've been speaking to him about this, and he's a great farmer. He's super progressive. He's he's been his whole life he's been on the bleeding edge of trying to progressive thinking in farming, and so he's an exceptionally high quality farmer, but. He said, it's the stupidest profession in the world. Every year, the value of our goods goes down, right? So they're getting poorer the harder and better they work. It's mad. And so the game, if we want to simplify it down for people, the game is make paper money, do things that create paper money, and then take that paper money and put it into real hard assets. Now, the paper money is what we're talking about in terms of the Australian dollar, fiat currencies. Money that is not fundamentally hard, right? It has got no hard characteristics. It's not collateralized. It's not secured against anything. That is our monetary system. So it's basically make fiat or make paper dollars or make paper money, put it into hard assets. That's the game. So it's how quickly can you get the paper, and then how do you put that paper into hard assets? Real estate is a fantastic one because of the leverage ratio. Now, I just want to go back to the real estate point, and one of the reasons it's so good, if we agree that we've established in this podcast that we have broadly a 15% hurdle rate that we need to jump in order to get ahead. 15% is kind of the rate at which you can maintain your wealth. Better than 15% is the rate at which you would increase your wealth, okay? So how would you do that? Because if you look at other assets, you've got gold has very broadly, and by the way, if you want to know where I got this from, I got it from Macro Trends. I looked at the gold prices over from June 2011 to June 2024. The compound annual growth rate in the price of gold, or the value of gold, is 3.2% a year. The ASX from June 2024 from June 2014 to June 2024 has only gone up by a compound annual growth rate of 3.5% a year. It's had some years where it's ripped, but that's because it crashed first and ripped up. If you actually look at the values, and I got that from tradingeconomics.com, if anyone else wants to go and fact check that, because I was really surprised at how low that was over a 10-year period. I was really surprised. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? How are you going to get ahead? How are you going to beat a 15% hurdle rate? And realistically, it's going to be with real estate and debt. Because if you can apply debt to real estate, which has got structural reasons the price is not going to go down, and then you apply debt, you can routinely get 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, triple digit return on invested capital rates, which is the only real way that you're going to make a difference. Go.
Let me jump in there. We're not talking necessarily about the rate at which the properties are increasing.
No.
Because you might have a low deposit. So
Correct.
We're talking about the return on investment. So we're comparing apples with apples.
Yeah,
right?
Totally. If I take
$100,000
and put it into the ASX 200, now According to the data I just got from Trading Economics, that's 3.5% a year over the last 10 years has gone up. Let's just say it's 7% because that kind of feels more like what it probably would be over a 40-year period, right? So if you put $100,000 in the ASX 200, it's going to go up by 7% a year. Well, the hurdle rate's 15%. If you put $100,000, unless you're leveraging that, then you're going to get a 7% return. If you put $100,000 down into property, and then let's say I'm going to oversimplify this because I'm not going to count stamp duty and stuff like that. But if you put a $100,000 deposit in a $500,000 property and you're using 80% LVR, so $100,000 deposit, $400,000 of debt to buy a $500,000 property, okay, you've got the same $100,000 invested, but then you've expanded its total value using debt. If that $500,000 property goes up by 10%, you've made $50,000, which is a 50% return on invested capital. You put in 100, the asset went up by 50, you make the spread between the debt and the value, which is $50,000. You've made a 50% return on invested capital. That's how you get ahead. That's how you get over that 15%. Because if you're not hitting that 15%, if you're less than 15%, you're progressively getting poorer. If you're over the 15%, you're progressively getting richer. That is how to get the 15%. Now, some people might be listening and go, well, yeah, I could do that with shares as well. You can get loans. Now, let me tell you a story about that. There was a financial company. There was a woman. She was left with $3 million after her husband passed away. Goes to one financial planner. They say, look, we can get you 5%. She talks to another financial planner. They say, no, we can be more aggressive. We can leverage you up. We can get you 7. They leverage her up to $10 million. So they use her $3 million. They borrow 7. They get her up to 10 mil that is now invested. Volatility in the market, a few wrong stocks, a GFC can come out of nowhere, black swan events. Suddenly her portfolio goes down by 40%. And so that's more than the 3 million. And so then she's like, well, what happens now? And they said, well, you don't have your 3 million anymore and you owe us $1 million. And that's it. She's wiped out. Now, that is the risk that you have with stocks if you leverage up. You don't have the same level of risk if you leverage up with property because the government is at pains to make sure that we don't have a massive crash. And there are so many measures that the government has put in place to make sure that borrowing on property doesn't get too out of control that we would risk a crash. Other countries have crashes. Australia, we don't have property crashes because there are so many measures in place to prevent that from happening. And because that's not going to happen, or because the chances of that happening, I believe the government's not going to let it happen, that means you can invest and you can leverage up with so much security, so much confidence. You don't necessarily need to be worried. Or you don't get the wrong property. If you get the wrong property, then you're in trouble. Yeah,
right?
Because real estate markets can go down. Right? So everyone thinks if you look at the whole Australian real estate market, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think the most that we've seen in a decline was like 11% in the GFC. Don't quote me on that, but let's call it 10%. But individual markets can decline by much more than that. Right. And so the risk with leverage is if the volatility is greater than your LVR, that's where you can run into trouble. Right. So yeah, if you've got 50% leverage on some shares and then the price drops by more than 50%, you're going to get margin called and you're going to lose all your money. You're going to owe them money. And I know a lot of people have gotten into a lot of trouble. Same thing goes with crypto, right? If you leverage crypto and it goes down by 80%, bang, you can find yourself in a lot of trouble. The benefit with real estate in Australia is that broadly, it's very stable, very low volatility. So you're able to apply debt much more safely and get those returns. And if you look at the risk-adjusted returns, it's the best. It's the best return you can get. So Bitcoin, for example, has gone up by about 64% a year over the last. Let me just double check that. Since November 2015, it's gone up by about 64% compound annual growth rate, right? So that sounds pretty good, but you could probably do the same thing in real estate using debt without being overexposed to risk. Simply by using debt buying Australian residential real estate, you probably get about the same, right? So which is pretty awesome. Actually, on a compound annual growth rate, don't quote me on that. It's not investment advice. Disclaimer. But I need to do the maths on that one. Actually, it's pretty good.
The door opened and then it was quickly.
Yeah. The point being, though, from a risk-adjusted return basis, it's still going to be the best, right? Because it's stable, it's growing. There's a high utility value. There's a high need. There's less stock being produced than what people need. It's a hard asset. Money supply increases, all of that kind of stuff, and so the volatility is quite low. As long as you're buying the right property in the right place at the right time, you're going to make a smart decision to continue to grow your wealth. And using leverage, you can beat that 15% hurdle rate.
100%. Now, with Bitcoin, since you've mentioned it, okay, the compound annual growth rate of 64.7% might sound absolutely fantastic, but this is not an asset that the government is geared up to manage. You think of all of the infrastructure that we have around property and the way the government manages it and makes sure that they get paid. They don't have that for Bitcoin. So even if you are thinking, well, that's 64.7%, that sounds really bloody good. I might just have a poke at that and maybe store some of my cash there instead of dropping it into property. You've got to worry about a number of things, like will the government ban it, right? Like or gold, right? Don't forget that the government has confiscated gold off people before. And things like that. So
there's governmental risk with Bitcoin, but I actually think the biggest risk is that it loses its mimetic value, right? So mimetic value is value that's ascribed because we all agree that it's valuable. Now, as I mentioned, like the benefit with Bitcoin is that it's got an incredibly low stock to flow ratio. It's actually lower than gold. It's the hardest money around. It's a unit of account, a medium of exchange, a store of value. It's all of those things. It's a commodity. It's got so many awesome, interesting things about it. But at the end of the day, outside of things like I can transfer, Bitcoin at the speed of light across the world and all of that kind of stuff, it still holds mimetic value, right? So if the network collapsed, because the reason it is increasing in value is because of network effect broadly, and so if the network collapsed, i.e., people just decided for whatever reason, actually, we found something better, more interesting, or we don't want to do that, or for whatever reason, the mimetic value broke down, then it would cease to grow. The difference with Australian residential real estate is its real world utility value. Now, just to be clear, I believe that Bitcoin does also have real world utility value as well. I think it is a good asset, and we could talk about that at a different point in time. But the thing is, people need houses to live in. And so there's like a greater real world asset, real world need or utility for residential real estate, because people are still going to need that over time. So it's interesting, because I still think on balance, Australian residential real estate is the best performing asset class that you can get, particularly if you add 80 to 90% leverage on it.
Alrighty. Well, that feels like a pretty good spot at which to wrap things up. Thank you, Goose, for jumping on again.
My pleasure. Great to be here. Let's do some more of these, because I think that if people can understand the macroeconomics that are driving real estate, I think they'll be able to make better investing decisions overall. So,
all right, brilliant.
Thanks.
Well, stay tuned. It sounds like we're going to be having Goose back on for another episode sometime soon. But from everyone here at Dashdot, thanks very much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
See ya.